this is an extraordinary topic. I think this is probably one of the most important political and cultural and sociological and frankly human topics that one can discuss. I've told you before how Professor Jack Forbes, professor of Native American Studies at the University of California at Davis, shared with me in a lengthy interview. I flew out there to sit with him for a couple of days. He wrote the book Columbus and Other Cannibals, an appropriate discussion for Columbus Day here, about how genocide had been visited upon this continent by the Europeans. How he talked about so many Native American societies, not all, but most Native American societies had reached a point where they no longer had war. Instead, they resolved conflicts by games like lacrosse, or counting coup was actually when the first drop of blood was drawn. That was when everything stopped, and the goal was to draw blood from your opponent, but not to wound them or injure them in a serious way. And it was almost like a game with a little bit of blood. And football, I think you could argue, is a variation on that. Oh, look at the guy got injured, and it's kind of the same thing. But this was a way of a method of conflict resolution, as well as communities interacting with each other. David Swanson wrote a book called War is a Lie that I think is one of the most important books that's been published in years. And he has a follow-up to it, a new book out called War No More: The Case for Abolition. David, welcome to the program, or welcome back to the program.
Hey, Tom. Great to hear from you.
Thanks for being with us. Lay out your case.
Well, as you just began to give, there are examples throughout history and at the present time of societies living without war, or at least with much less war than ours. In fact, 96% of humanity as we speak is represented by governments that are far less militarized than the U.S. government. So we wouldn't be talking about going against some law of physics or part of human nature in proposing less militarism by the United States. But I think the argument has to be for abolition rather than reduction. We have to do away with war so that we aren't afraid of a war from someone else, and we have to keep the military for defense. And then, as Eisenhower foresaw, it creates offensive wars.
Right.
We have done away with all sorts of barbaric practices. We have virtually done away with slavery, with blood feuds, with dueling. We have put things on the list to be done away with, including nuclear weapons, including the death penalty, and are well on the way. But when it comes to war, we talk about waging better wars, civilized wars, wars without particular weapons, wars with international approval by coalitions, and so forth. We ought to be talking about abolishing war.
The abolition. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the question that inevitably is raised, and I was with a group of pretty profound and thoughtful people this weekend, and I brought up you in your book, and I recommended strongly to these folks that they read your book. And one of them, a person whose name you would immediately recognize, said, well, what would he have done, or what should we have done during World War II when we learned unambiguously that Hitler was gassing Jews and what was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, should we have not gone into World War? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Well, first of all, it's interesting and I think revealing that the argument always goes, just as this one has just gone, to a war 3/4 of a century ago, and that you can't find a case that you can convince any significant percentage of the population justifies the war machine in the 75 years since. You have to go back to that one. And once you go back to that one and look at it closely, it looks a lot less like something you want to justify going forward. This was a time in the world when nonviolent alternatives to war were much less understood. Little beginnings of them seen in the Netherlands and in Denmark and in the streets of Berlin showed the potential, but were nowhere close to being exercised. You go back to history and you look at a crisis, it's also helpful to look at how you got there. and the incredible punishment of the entire nation of Germany rather than the war makers following World War I, the West's support for the fascist government's rise in Germany as a preferable alternative to the communists in the Soviet Union, disastrous policies for decades leading up to a crisis. And then the crisis treated as if you had a choice of all-out war or nothing, is not the way to look at history. Needless to say, the Hitler's government was an absolute disaster that killed millions of innocent people, but the war killed tens of millions of innocent people. There was nothing worse than the war. Yeah. World War II is the worst thing.
40 million people, something like that, when you consider the Russians. There were over 20 million Russians died in that war.
50 to 70 million people worldwide, depending how you count it, who you believe. Majority of them civilian.
Now, are you suggesting that, for example, Hitler could have been stopped by the Swiss simply saying, we're no longer going to launder your money?
I'm suggesting that it would have helped. I'm suggesting that there is not a new Adolf Hitler on the horizon. People like to justify Thomas Jefferson's slavery because of the age he lived in, but they never go back and justify Franklin Roosevelt's war because of the age he lived in. We live in a different age.
I get it. The penny just dropped. I mean, so we no longer justify slavery, although we justified Jefferson's slavery, or some do, because that was the age he lived in. And he actually, Jefferson, throughout his political career, the first piece of legislation he offered as a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia was to end slavery. He tried over and over and over again to end slavery unsuccessfully and was badly punished for it a number of times. And so you're saying that we lived through an era of slavery, we set that aside. We lived through an era of warfare, we set that aside. It is time now to set war aside.
I think it is. I think that people imagine that you're going to need war to protect us, and they ought to be looking at the actual case in the world as it exists today, in which war is endangering us. As my book documents, experts within the U.S. and other governments testify and make clear, just as a young girl from Pakistan said to President Obama this week, your actions are making you less safe, not more safe.
Yeah, your drones are fueling terrorism, was what Malala said to the president over the weekend. We're talking with David Swanson. He has a new book out. It's called War No More, The Case for Abolition. You can buy it at all the usual suspects, I'm assuming, and also on David's website, davidswanson.org. And David, we have just a minute left. What is the main message that you want people to get?
To stop opposing dumb wars, to stop opposing bad wars, to stop opposing the most wasteful Pentagon spending more than we oppose the most efficient, deadly Pentagon spending, to start seeing the elimination of chemical weapons, the elimination of nuclear weapons, the reform of this murderous practice as steps toward the obvious, desirable end of its total abolition. To understand that murder, when it becomes a grand scale, is still murder and still as worthy of being eliminated from the world as individual murder. You kill someone with an axe, you're seen as a sociopath, you're seen as barbaric. You threaten to kill someone with a pistol, and it's an acceptable joke in our society.
Yeah, I got it. Well, so very well said. Please get over to davidswanson.org. You could read all about it. Spelled just the way it sounds, davidswanson.org. David Swanson, his new book, War No More, The Case for Abolition. Good luck with it, my friend.
Thank you, Tom.
Great talking with you, David. We'll be right back.